Today we're joined by Evan Kaeding, lead solutions engineer at Supermetrics. And Supermetrics is a global SaaS company and the market leader for marketing data delivery solutions. So over 15% of global ad spend, global digital ad spend, some $50 billion annually, and that's billion with a B, is reported or analyzed through Supermetrics. So welcome to the show, Evan.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You spoke at a Google event a couple of weeks ago, and the topic for your talk was future-proofing your growth with data. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty good kind of outline for what we're going to be talking about. First of all, if I could just get your kind of perspective on we're recording this in April of 2023. What are the biggest changes do you think that are happening as it relates to marketing, data, and analytics?
Yeah, biggest change is coming. Well, if you had asked me a month or two ago, AI probably wouldn't have been on that list. But certainly now I see that as one of the up and coming challenges and big changes coming up in the market. But it's also an opportunity. And I think it's an opportunity, especially for companies that have their data game basically locked down. The challenge that I think we've all been a little bit more familiar with over the course of the last couple of years has been advancing privacy regulations. According to Gartner, they're saying that about 75% of the world's, call them data subjects, are going to be subject to some form of privacy regulation over the course of the next 2 years by 2024, ultimately. Yeah. And what this means for organizations that have built their business, essentially their entire lead generation machine, their entire sales machine on top of ad networks that rely on things like third-party cookies or rely on easy, cheap access to audience data, are about to be in a very uncomfortable position. And the only thing that I try to emphasize to many of our customers, the customers that I advise, and really the folks that I speak with, is make sure your first-party data game is intact. Because if it is, that's going to place you really well in a position to take advantage of not only the encroaching legislation that's coming, but also take advantage of the new tools and technologies that are going to become available thanks to AI.
Got it. And obviously Europe, the EU, has been kind of at the forefront of this legislation. Do you have any kind of speculations on what's coming and when? And how quickly is this going to happen?
I think we've been dealing with this in Europe for quite a while now. And we've obviously been through GDPR. Yeah. In the US, we've seen CCPA. And we're seeing privacy legislation advancing on all major fronts, whether it's country specific, whether it's region specific, or even in the US, whether it's state specific. Yeah. And I think I'll pause on the question briefly just to kind of put one thing out there, which is it's not necessarily that, hey, these governments are tired of these businesses making, outsized profits, or, it's not Apple or Google that are, restricting my ability to use these, third-party cookies or targeting or any of those different technologies. It's the will of, to a large extent, democratic processes that have actually put us here. And people have voted, they have elected politicians, and these politicians are putting these laws in place at the will of the people. And so for marketers that are looking at this advancing wave of regulation, regardless of where their potential customers may be, you have to ask yourself, what are my customers voting for, essentially, and what have they voted for? And that's the piece that I think is really important from a mindset perspective, which is how can we respect the preferences of our customers, which ultimately have voted through a democratic process to give us these regulations. That's the piece that kind of got us to where we are today. Moving forward, I think private industry, to a large extent, is actually taking the ball and taking the cue from governments, right? So we see Apple advancing with their privacy features on the newest iPhones, on the Safari browsers as well. We see Google, of course, talking about the privacy sandbox they're going to be coming up with at some point in 2024 with a full deprecation of third-party cookies to a large extent inside of the Chrome browser. Between Safari and between Google, you're talking about market share of the browser space. It's 85% or so. Yeah. So really the vast majority of browsing traffic. So to a large extent, are individual countries and regulations going to impact the way you do your business? Of course, and they should, right? But I see actually that the technology companies that have to a large extent enabled this behavior over the last decade are really taking the lead on a lot of these things for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, Apple is a great example. It feels like they really put their kind of stake in the ground of wanting to be known as the privacy first kind of technology company. Just to get some, because there's a lot of talk about, you mentioned a lot of things like third-party cookies going away, etc. So just to kind of understand the implications and the magnitude of this, you and I both, so 3 years ago, iOS 14 came out. Apple pushed their new update that made it really, well, it gave a lot of control to users on how their data was being used. Mm-hmm. And it caused a lot of problems for companies like Facebook, which relied on that data for attribution, understanding, or really fueling their targeting for their advertising algorithms. And I know companies that went bankrupt because of this, because they were, reliant on Facebook for customer acquisition, like 80% coming from Facebook. Facebook ads became a lot less effective, mm-hmm. and it killed their business. So do you think that we're at a similar kind of event, that if you're really exposed to some of these technologies that you mentioned as a company, that it could have a really, really big negative impact? Or is this something that's going to happen slowly over time, and these platforms, Google, et cetera, are going to be able to come up with some solutions? So basic question, how worried should one be if you're kind of exposed to some of these potential things that are changing?
Yeah, I think if you're sitting in the executive seat, you're always asking yourself, how diverse is my supply chain for anything that you're looking at? And if you're in a marketer seat, your supply chain is customers and leads and customer data and sales ultimately, right? Like, how are these things coming into the business, and how can we make sure that we're diversified in the face of uncertainty? If you have a situation where you know how things are going to go in the future and you have a reasonably strong hypothesis, it's great to double down, and it's great to focus on that specific thing. But if you're entering an area of uncertainty, diversification can be one of the best mechanisms that you can have in your toolkit to ensure that you're able to weather the storm regardless of the size of the waves. So all of the analogies aside, the thing that I'm fairly certain about is building out your first-party data game is going to be absolutely crucial to making sure that you can leverage the tools and technologies that are made available by companies like Facebook and Google going forward. It's also going to position you to a large extent to actually be the owner of the relationship between your brand and your customers. As soon as you have that phone number, as soon as you have that email, as soon as you have some reason to connect with that customer, that consenting customer, I might add as well, then you put yourself in a very good position because you're not specifically reliant on a vendor-controlled platform. Mm-hmm. So those first-party relationships anyway are really important to build and really important to get the trust and consent of your customers. Yeah. Now, when you're looking at your supply chain from a from a marketing perspective, you look at the different ad networks, you look at the different ad platforms, you want to, of course, not be overly reliant on one single acquisition channel. And so spreading your bets among a couple of key different players in the market is usually what I recommend, because like you said, that Facebook algorithm changed. All of a sudden, many agencies that I was working with, essentially their campaigns were either no longer working, or maybe they were working, but they didn't know how to measure it because app tracking was effectively removed overnight. And so we at Supermetrics certainly saw some customers of ours in the agency space, but also in the brand space, who were overly reliant on a specific piece of that Facebook technology, basically wipe them out overnight. So concentrate on the things that you know and can control, but make sure that you're diversified in a way in which you can take advantage of new opportunities that come up, would be my recommendation kind of from the executive side of things.
That's a really good point, that if you have a crystal ball, then of course you would double down on whatever's going to be working really well for the next 18, 24 months. But if you don't, then you need to kind of diversify. So you mentioned first-party data and that being like the crucial thing that you need to invest in. What practically speaking are we talking about? What kind of data should companies be thinking about? Because I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not necessarily a case of more is better. So what should they be focusing on? Yeah.
So when we talk about data collection at Supermetrics, we kind of categorize things into 3 different buckets with kind of a key underarching theme of data governance. So data governance being the key underarching theme, I applied to some extent a larger, broader application of data governance. So many people think data governance is who has access to the data, where is it safe, is it secure, is it compliant, all of these different things. Yes, those are all data governance. But I also talk about data hygiene as well as part of data governance. And that needs to be enforced actually in a pretty rigid way to make sure that the data is available to fuel other parts of the business. What are those other parts of the business? That brings me into the 3 buckets. So the 3 buckets that we look at from a marketing perspective are bucket number 1, campaign monitoring and reporting. Where is your media being spent? How much is being spent? Are you delivering on the CPMs that you need? Cost, clicks, impressions, those kinds of things. Then we talk about insights. And I think for a large portion of the audience, campaign monitoring and reporting and insights were effectively the same thing over the course of the last 10 years, right? You put money into the campaign, you see the conversions all on the same platform, everything works great. But now we're entering into a world where you can't necessarily trust the platform that you're advertising on with also showing you the results of that campaign. And so we're actually starting to bucket insights and analysis into a separate kind of data collection paradigm, where insights and analysis, that's how you use the data to understand what marketing channels are most effective. That is basically going to be doing your attribution modeling. That's going to be fueling any kind of MMM that you might be working on as a large B2B or B2C brand. That's going to fuel any kind of insights that you want to derive from your campaigns around which audiences, which geos, which products are best performing across my set of campaigns. So that insights and analysis piece is super crucial. And if you think data governance is just about who has access to the right data, you're going to be very sorry when you try to start going to make sense of that data around what campaigns are actually working. Bucket number 3 is data activation. This is probably the most important piece for data governance. This is where you actually take data from your CRM, from your email marketing platform, and you actually use that to funnel that data strictly into other areas of the business that can use that data for a variety of different things. So it could be segmenting your customer data in your CRM based on product preference, so you can send personalized emails with product recommendations. It could be building audiences on top of that data that you can then push out to networks like Google or networks like Facebook, for example, for retargeting. It could be a variety of things, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can segment and clean that first-party data to make sure that it's very useful for you as a business. So the combination of data governance as kind of the unifying layer, not only governing access, but also governing the cleanliness of that data, is super important to make sure that you can have your marketing data applied both for the campaign monitoring and reporting, the insights and analysis piece, and also the data activation side of things.
Perfect. To someone listening, this might sound a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of buckets. There's a lot of things that they should be thinking about. Does this mean that you need to hire for that? You need to have someone dedicated to manage the kind of the data?
Yeah, so I think the best teams that I see that are able to accomplish this are really a cross-function of marketing and data. When I talk to companies at Supermetrics specifically, I can't tell you the number of calls that I've been on where it's the very first time the marketing team is actually meeting the data team. They're literally meeting on the call and they're introducing each other. And it's a frightening state of affairs because we need to basically teach 2 independent organizations within the business how to communicate with each other. Now, thankfully, Supermetrics has a set of tools designed specifically for data engineers, but also for marketers to make sure that, they can actually collaborate within the Supermetrics platform. So to some extent, we are naturally facilitating that. But to a large extent, when we look at companies across the spectrum, the data teams are not necessarily speaking the same language as the marketing teams. Marketing might say, well, this is an evergreen campaign and this is a performance campaign. And the data team says, well, they both have cost, clicks, and impressions. You need to get the CPM for that, right? And it's like, well, depends on what kind of campaign it is. Okay, where can I pull for that in the API? So on and so forth, right? So what we find is that when marketing teams are deeply integrated with teams, or maybe a marketing team is augmented with a data specialist in that team, that's where we start to see the real performance come in. Where, for example, you might have a performance team of 5, you might have a creative team or a brand team, for example, of 5. You might have a couple of data engineers or data analysts embedded in those teams who might be able to work with a centralized data platforms team to make sure that they can get the data they need, they can build the insights and analysis and reporting they need, and leverage maybe some of the larger IT assets that the company has built out. So kind of building those smaller federated teams around those specific functions is what I've seen work. Yeah, I'd say that's probably the closest approach. Obviously, different companies, different sizes, different scales. We also see this applied at the global level as well. So at Supermetrics, we work with a couple of different global brands who come to us and say, we operate in 70 different countries, and it's very difficult for us to get any kind of sense of what our media looks like across these different countries. And so that federated approach really is ultimately what it comes down to, because you'll always have a global campaign for global budgets. But depending on the brand, a lot of that money is going to be spent at the local level. So you need to be empowering those local users with their own team of data analysts to ensure that they get the reports they need on the ground, but that all of that data can also be fed up to the global level so that exercises like MMM, where you really do need all of that data, can still be fruitful exercises.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting there about the first two buckets and how they used to be the same thing and now they're not. So it'd be fair to say that previously we could rely on what was being reported inside a platform like Facebook. And now we have to kind of go through a lot of different hoops and figure kind of triangulate, or whatever the word is, to figure out what's actually true. So, and that certainly has been a trend that I've noticed as well. So if you could kind of go into that a little bit and talk about attribution. And obviously that exists on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Depending on what kind of data you have access to, and also what kind of knowledge and resources you have to analyze and understand that. So if we could start on like the lower end. Let's say you're a company that doing 10 million revenue, you don't have a designated data scientist or someone who really, really deeply understands attribution and things of that nature. What kind of tools what kind of tools would you recommend for those kind of companies to, in this day and age where reporting insight has just become a lot more, gaining insights from the data is just a lot more difficult than looking up a number inside an account.
Yeah, I think the first step I would look at is what kind of conversion reporting makes sense for your business. There are three different kind of categories of conversion reporting that I look at. One is in-platform conversion reporting. So this would be, for example, you're spending money on TikTok and TikTok says, here's how many conversions you got, right? That is going to be in-platform. Now, the way in which they actually use that or develop those conversions is going to be different based on the platform you're working on. Facebook's going to have a different one. Google's going to have a different one, for example. Snapchat's going to have a different one. So if you're comparing in-platform conversions across platforms, you're not necessarily looking at anything apples to apples. Yeah. To a large extent, these are also going to rely on pixels placed either in your browser or some kind of app SDK for conversion tracking or something like that. Now, we already mentioned that, well, okay, third-party cookies are going away, so the effectiveness of those pixels is going down, especially as consent rates go down. Yeah. But also, we are in a space where the app tracking as well is being degraded. So what these companies have done is they've moved toward building out modeled conversions. Yeah. And these modeled conversions essentially are where they use their machine learning algorithms to try to understand how many people probably converted as a result of seeing your ad. How much do you trust that as a business? I've seen it be actually fairly reliable for some kinds of businesses. I've seen it be completely off for other businesses. Right. That brings me to, and how do you check that, right? Yeah. That brings me to the second part, which is the actual verification of that. So when you look at actual conversions, that's when you actually look at your e-commerce platform or your CRM. Right. So that's what I usually ask for in terms of the most pessimistic result, which is, okay, how many customers ended up in our CRM? How many orders did we generate? How many unique customers were there actually? So using that as your baseline, you're never going to overestimate that. Right. And so if you're looking at getting like a cost per acquisition or some kind of return on ad spend, that's going to be probably your most pessimistic way to look at it, because no one's going to be faking orders essentially inside of your CRM. That would be a problem. That would be a problem to have. Yeah, exactly. Then you have the third piece, which is analytics conversions, right? Analytics conversions would be the kind of conversions that are reported from Google Analytics, from Adobe Analytics, from newer entrants to the market like Pivot Pro or Matomo or some other companies like that. Those historically have been fairly reliable and what I would say have been, to a large extent, the best and most accessible for not only getting the conversions, but understanding, at least to some extent, the path that the user took to get to where they are. However, I'm seeing already the relevance associated with those kind of declining because as as cookie consent rates continue to fall, well, those trackers aren't necessarily firing on all the same websites that they used to. So you're actually getting less data availability there. And so Google Analytics now has actually started to move toward modeled conversions as well. And again, to what extent do those modeled conversions make sense for your business? That's something you'll need to decide, and you'll need to verify against your CRM. Also, I guess maybe fresh off the presses as well, this last weekend, a new WebKit update went into Safari that is going to, I won't get into the details here, but it's actually going to restrict to some extent the ability to place first-party cookies. So even technologies like server-side tracking that have come out to some extent to try to mitigate these things are already being blocked to a large extent intentionally by companies like Apple, who are primarily privacy first. So it's always going to be kind of a cat and mouse game in those cases. True first-party cookies, of course, are going to continue to be there. But are they going to be able to be used for marketing and for tracking? For how much longer? That's not something I can say.
Right.
So those are the three kinds of conversions that we're looking at, right? Are any of these perfect? No, not necessarily, but you should probably look at all of them at least to try to understand what that looks like. So of course, your single source of truth is going to be, or your main source of truth is going to be your CRM, your e-commerce, whatever that happens to look like. If you find that the in-platform conversions nicely correlate with those, great. If you find that your analytics conversions correlate with those, that's great as well. You can also throw all of the conversion tracking out the window and basically say, hey, we're going to do MMM as a global brand essentially, and we're going to try to see if there's a statistically strong relationship between our marketing spend and our conversions. Again, that is going to use your CRM or your e-commerce platform as the source of truth. So for companies who are getting started, there's nothing wrong with necessarily looking at the in-platform conversions or the analytics-based conversions, as long as they reasonably correlate to what you're seeing in the CRM. That's a great way to get started very quickly. But if you have the resources at your disposal to do something larger and potentially more sophisticated, more comprehensive, I think that's definitely where you want to be investing some of your resources.
Yeah. I think that's a really good approach, kind of keeping it practical, that if you're getting good enough kind of indications from whatever, Facebook, for instance, then feel free to continue using that. You mentioned MMM, so media mix modeling. When should you start thinking about moving from just looking at these essentially free tools? Well, it's not essentially free tools like your analytics or in-platform conversions, to then actually having to put a lot of time and effort into building something like your own, trying to model it yourself. At what point does that become actually like economically viable?
Yeah, it really comes down to I'm as much as I'm into marketing analytics, I don't like marketing analytics for the sake of marketing analytics, right? If you're spending $1,000 a month on marketing, you're never going to see a return no matter how much you put into marketing analytics, right? Yeah. And so you have to equate how difficult is it going to be for my team to spin up one of these big models versus how much do we intend to save. If you're spending $100K a month and you have a team of 5 people who are going to actually work on building out some of these attribution models, well, okay, you're spending $1.2 million a year. Maybe you're spending about $1 million a year in salaries. Are you really seeing the leverage that you want off of that team? Are you going to be able to improve your ad spend enough to justify the existence of that team? Probably not, right? Yeah. But if you're looking at, okay, now we're spending $1 million a month, or we're spending $5 million a month, then all of a sudden that 5-person team starts to look like it has a lot more leverage, because then you improve ad performance by 1%, even 5% or something like that. That's going to pay for the entire team. Yeah. So I think I'm always in favor of looking at the actual value created from a lot of these activities, because analytics for the sake of analytics, to a large extent, is not something that we want to be in the business of doing. Yeah. It's got to be proportionate to the marketing spend and the efficiencies that can be gained. There are also other areas where I think data teams can do a better job at quantifying the value they bring to the business. So for example, if you're able to institute a data governance program where all of a sudden you have clean insights for campaign monitoring reporting, you can analyze where your data is going and which campaigns are most effective. And you can build out some of those audience segments that maybe enable you to reach customers in a more cost-efficient way, or maybe give you a better opportunity to sell to those customers or sell higher margin products to those customers. Yeah. That's another great way that data teams can be seen not only as a cost center, but as a revenue center.
Yeah.
And so I kind of see, if you're talking about marketing data teams, there should probably be a few activities that they're tasked with. Each one should have a very clear line item as to how it's helping the business and how it's helping the business achieve its goals, whether it's through reducing costs or increasing revenue.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned. You mentioned a couple of times that modeling is going to be a big thing. Model conversions as a way to close the gap between what they're not able to track anymore, essentially. And there's a big question there is, how do you trust it? And as you mentioned, it's not necessarily 100% reliable or not reliable. It's going to depend a lot from business to business. But I feel like I see this same trend as it could, and that could also relate to, let's say, something like an MMM. Okay, you built this model, but then it spits out something. Mm-hmm. But then there's a whole other question of like, well, do we trust what this model says? So do you see that as well with, we're in a place where we have a lot of data, but it's so much of a black box on how it's actually being generated that it ends up, it's very precise. And we can get it we can slice it in a million different ways. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, we get a report, the client or the business leader, whoever it is, looks at it and says, okay, this looks great, but I don't have enough conviction in this number to double our marketing spend. Mm-hmm. So do you think that there's an issue there when it comes to trusting data and inside organizations? Mm-hmm. And if so, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to testing more than anything, right? So before you make a big bet, you de-risk that bet by incrementally testing each individual piece. Mm-hmm. If your data says, hey, this channel is super lucrative for us, but we're not spending enough on it, great, let's increase the spend by 10%, 20%, enough to make us statistically significant increase, right? Are we seeing that ROI? Okay, great. We've done that. Now let's try that for different products or for different regions as well. Is this looking good? Is this not? Okay, great. We've incrementally de-risked the placement risk, the geo risk, the product risk overall, and we've increased the budget and we've seen returns. Great. Now let's go ahead and put a significant amount of money on that particular piece now that we've de-risked that and we've been able to justify and show that it does have these incremental returns. You always need to be careful, of course, because I think with any advertising network, there are diminishing returns. In fact, those are baked into MMM models to a large extent. So if you have a good partner who's building out the MMM for you, or you have a team who's able to model these things, you can usually see, where does my incremental dollar go the furthest, and at what point should I stop spending? And if you have a good estimate of what that is, then you'll know exactly when to stop spending. But to a large extent, you might not know what that is until you overspend to a large extent and get to that point where, okay, we overspent a little bit. All of a sudden our CPAs went down. We still got good lead volume, we still got good customer volume, but overall it wasn't as high of a return as we needed. So then you move back to kind of the testing phase. So marketing is always fluid in the sense that, even if you've got a combination of evergreen campaigns and tactical acquisition campaigns, you should always be testing and iterating, because consumer preferences are changing, the marketing technology landscape is changing, people on different platforms are changing. So it's a constantly moving set of tides.
I love the approach you mentioned. It makes a lot of sense. What do you see as what are the common mistakes that companies make when trying to implement this kind of, let's just test it, see what the incremental results are, and then we'll allocate based on that? What are the mistakes that they're making in kind of pursuing that kind of process?
I see companies making the mistake of trying to eat the whole elephant at once. To use the elephant analogy here, is that trying to spin up a big team, trying to essentially tackle their entire set of web properties, whether it's website, app, and then you've got out-of-home placements, you've got digital ads, you've got TV ads, you've got pretty much everything that you're trying to roll in. But if you've never built an ad tracking kind of system before, if you've never built a campaign monitoring dashboard or reporting, it's pretty challenging to start from scratch and get it right the first time. And so we see companies approaching this and de-risking it. Global companies have the advantage of de-risking it by region, for example. So some large multinationals we look at, and we'll talk to them and say, hey, who in your network is best positioned to take the lead on this? And they instantly know, hey, the guys down in Belgium, the guys down in Australia, the teams down there, the guys and girls, they know exactly what they're doing, and they're going to be the best to pilot it. They'll go out, they'll build it, they'll do essentially a global POC. Once that's successful, then they're going to know, hey, this is actually going to be something that we can copy and paste across the different regions in which we operate. So a couple of large CPG brands that we're working with, can't name them, of course, at this point, but that's the model that we've seen, is incrementally de-risk those projects by testing them out in smaller markets.
Got it. Yeah, and of course, if you'd be if you're a company that doesn't have access, let's say a single market company, then you could maybe do something with different segments or different product categories in general. I wanted to ask also one thing that I've kind of been thinking about myself as it comes to, so when it comes to data, you obviously have this quantitative data that you're collecting through these various platforms, and it's very useful. And obviously, Supermetrics is kind of that's what you guys do. What role do you see qualitative, subjective data, and just to kind of talking to customers or users, and how do you kind of balance those two? Personally, how do you think companies should approach that? Should we be just looking at the data that we can collect quantitatively from platforms, or should we also be infusing kind of our own impressions, our own judgment based on what we see and hear?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of qualitative data that you just can't overlook. Having customer conversations certainly is something that I think is going to lead to extremely valuable results for every business. If you're in the B2B space, sitting in on a sales call, right? If you're a marketer, if you're in the B2C space, either speaking with customers individually through focus groups or running surveys or those kinds of things, getting kind of some voice of the customer activities, those are super valuable as well. We don't particularly specialize in that at Supermetrics. So I'd say for me, at least, that's a little bit outside of my domain, but I've certainly had companies come to us and say, hey, we need to tackle this initiative on a marketing side because we learned from our voice of the customer activities that they're having a poor experience on mobile. How can we help fix that? Right? Yeah. Or, hey, we're having a poor experience because the ad that we're seeing is for a product that's no longer in stock on our website, right? And that's something that they learned, that's an insight that they gathered from some kind of focus group.
Yeah. I love that, kind of working closely, and especially, tying sales and marketing together and just having maybe regular meetings, talk about what you're seeing. I think there are so many insights that can be gained from that really helps both parties understand and do their job better. So final question. This is a podcast about growth mainly. And so obviously we're really excited and interested in growth stories. Supermetrics is one of the preeminent Finnish growth stories. You guys founded in 2013, I think,
somewhere around there. Yeah.
And crossed 50 million ARR last year. So huge growth and massive success story. So I'd just be curious kind of hear, you've been at the company now for 2 or 3 years, I think?
Yeah, about 2.5.
Yeah. So I'd just be interested to hear kind of your take on what it's been like and what's been kind of the secret ingredient to this 10-decade plus overnight success. Yeah. What's been kind of the key to this kind of sustained and rapid growth?
Yeah, I think I'll take the opportunity to briefly tell my story about Supermetrics as well. So I was a Supermetrics customer for several years prior to joining. And so back in 2017, when I was helping launch some startups, I used Supermetrics because I was, of course, in any startup, you wear a lot of different hats. So I had marketing roles, I had analytics roles, I had sales roles even. And so, of course, I needed to save as much time as I could consolidating my reporting. And I used Supermetrics at 2 of the startups that I was working with. And then I went agency side for several years. And then I had the opportunity to use Supermetrics for several of our large enterprise clients for doing much of the same things that we were talking about today. And so I realized, hey, this Supermetrics tool has been kind of a common theme across my 3 roles. Seems like there's some pretty good value here all the way from the SMB side up to the enterprise side. I wonder what their hiring situation looks like. So looked them up online, found out they were building a sales team here in Helsinki. And I applied for the role and I ended up getting it. And they said, great, Evan, we're ready to relocate you. This was, of course, in 2020 in the middle of COVID. And they said, we're happy to relocate you either to Helsinki or Atlanta, Georgia. And I said, well, I'm sure Atlanta's nice. I've never been there, but hard to pass up the opportunity to relocate internationally. So I jumped at it. When I joined Supermetrics, it was about 120 employees or so. And I think at that point, we only had one other solutions engineer. Sales team was still fairly we knew at that time. I don't remember the specific numbers, maybe 20 or 30 at that point. But it was clear that when we had launched our data warehousing line of products, we needed some kind of technical folks to be customer facing as well. And so that's what the solution engineering team was started as. So we launched our data warehousing line of products around 2018, 2019 or so, and have grown that to be a pretty significant portion of company revenue. I won't say the specific amount, but now we're, I guess, a bona fide player both in the traditional set of markets that we're kind of known for, and kind of the Google Sheets and Looker Studio markets that a lot of SMBs and mid-market companies use us for. But we've also, to a large extent, made big advances in the enterprise space with large data warehousing customers as well, who are looking to up their first-party data game with their campaign monitoring data, their insights data, and their CRM and first-party data. Key to success, I'd say, certainly what brought me here was an excellent product. I think, as a SaaS company, that's just not something you can ignore. And I think one of the things that, to me, as a customer, certainly was clear was that early on in the days of Supermetrics, the value that was created for me as a user was significantly higher than the amount of money that I was paying to use the tool.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so I knew, okay, like I'm experiencing this giant delta between what I'm getting and what I'm paying. And I think to a large extent that actually helped Supermetrics gain a pretty rapid set of customers really from the get-go. We're one of the largest companies in the space from a customer count perspective. We have over 17,000 customers. And I'd say because of that, we have a lot of our customers who are super small, but when they grow, we grow with them. And so that has kind of propelled the company to be in a space where we're not hurting for lack of customers. What we're trying to do now is how do we kind of shake the image that we have of kind of this Google Sheets add-on or Looker Studio add-in to, hey, we actually have several companies who are large multinational enterprises who are using these tools to do very exciting things. So how can we kind of convey that to the customers that we want to talk to going forward? So key answer, I would say, is making sure to put product first. That was kind of the growth engine. And then we've since added a sales engine on top of that to accelerate that growth up market and just make sure that everything that we're doing is scalable and is bulletproof. Because when you do want to move up market, there are going to be additional things that you need to do, additional capabilities you need to build out. And so focusing on the team building around that, focusing on the quality control, those are all kinds of things that you need to just keep in mind as you're starting to grow your average customer size. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting kind of transition that you guys are in from, like you said, being known as a kind of plug-in to actually working towards enterprise customers. And it seems like you guys are doing a good job there. I think you also gave some good career advice for people that if, look at the tools that you love using where there's a big delta between the cost and the benefit and see if they're hiring.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was, it's been a great experience ever since. So yeah, I've been in Finland for about 2.5 years now, and recently had my partner relocate over to Finland as well. So she's now here in Finland has been here for about 6 months and has found employment as well. So we're both happy to be over here on the Nordic side of things.
Happy to have you here. And thank you so much for coming on. Wish you all the best here in Finland, and all best of luck to all the guys and girls at Supermetrics as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.